The last person anyone expected the university's golden student to fall for was the quiet freshman who spent more time repairing forgotten books than making friends. And if someone had told me that only a few months earlier, I would have laughed and walked away. Looking back now, I realize everything changed long before either of us understood what was happening. My name is Maverick Jones. I was 20 years old when I arrived at Hawthorne University with one suitcase, a scholarship that barely covered tuition, and a promise to myself that I would keep my life simple. I had learned growing up that expectations could disappear overnight, but skills stayed with you forever. That was probably why I loved restoring old books. Damaged pages did not judge anyone. Torn bindings did not care whether you came from money or whether your family name appeared on the walls of donor buildings. If you were patient enough, almost anything could be repaired. Most afternoons after class, while other freshmen gathered outside the student union or packed the fitness center, I walked across the quiet east courtyard to the university archives tucked beneath the original library. The place smelled faintly of cedar shelves, aging paper, and furniture polish. Most students never even knew it existed, which suited me perfectly. The archive director, Mrs. Diane Lee, trusted me to clean fragile collections and help preserve journals that were older than the state itself. It was peaceful work, and peace was something I valued more than popularity. Meanwhile, everyone on campus knew Kim Martinez. Even if they had never spoken to him, they knew his name. His photograph seemed to appear everywhere. Campus newsletters, leadership banners, scholarship ceremonies, alumni magazines. Professors praised him during lectures. Incoming freshmen heard stories about him during orientation. Kim was 22, a senior, a white American student of partial Korean ancestry with neatly styled dark side-parted hair, and the kind of quiet confidence that never looked forced. He was called the university's golden student because he seemed to excel at everything that mattered. His grades were nearly perfect. He led the student council without sounding arrogant. Companies competed to recruit him before graduation. Faculty members trusted him with projects that usually went to graduate students. Students admired him for reasons that went beyond awards. Somehow, despite all the attention surrounding him, people described him as approachable. I never questioned whether those stories were true because our worlds never crossed. People like Kim belonged in auditoriums filled with applause. People like me belonged in climate-controlled archive rooms wearing cotton gloves while repairing cracked leather bindings. That distance felt completely natural. During my first semester, I watched him exactly twice. Once from across the campus lawn when hundreds of students applauded after he finished giving a welcome speech to scholarship recipients. Another time through a library window as he patiently helped a nervous freshman who had accidentally spilled coffee across a stack of notes. Neither moment seemed important. They were simply reminders that some people naturally belonged at the center of every room while others were happiest remaining unnoticed. My own routine rarely changed. Morning classes, afternoon archive work, dinner at the dining hall before it became crowded, evening studying in a quiet corner of the library. I avoided unnecessary drama because I had come to Hawthorne for one reason: earn my degree, build a future, go home without regrets. That plan remained perfectly intact until an ordinary Tuesday near the middle of October. Mrs. Lee walked into the restoration room carrying a thin folder and a puzzled expression. She adjusted her reading glasses before looking directly at me. "Maverick, I think the history department made a scheduling mistake," she said. "They accidentally assigned someone to work beside you on the Founder Heritage Project." I shrugged without looking up from the century-old journal I was repairing. "That happens sometimes." "Not like this," she replied. "This student specifically requested archive access after the correction notice arrived." Finally, I looked up. Mrs. Lee opened the folder, glanced down once more to confirm the name, then smiled in a way that made absolutely no sense. "It looks like," she said carefully, "your new project partner is Kim Martinez." At first I honestly thought she was joking. Then she slid the assignment sheet across the table, and before I could say a single word, footsteps echoed through the archive hallway, stopped just outside the restoration room, and someone knocked gently on the open door. The knock was followed by a calm voice that sounded nothing like the confident speeches I had heard across campus. "Excuse me, am I interrupting?" Mrs. Lee smiled toward the doorway before I even turned around. Kim Martinez stood there holding a notebook instead of the leather portfolio I had expected someone like him to carry. He wore a navy sweater over a white button-down shirt with dark jeans and clean sneakers, looking more like an ordinary college student than the university's most celebrated senior. "Right on time," Mrs. Lee said. "I will let the two of you get acquainted." She quietly disappeared into her office before either of us could object. For several awkward seconds, neither of us spoke. Kim glanced around the restoration room with genuine curiosity, studying the shelves filled with archival boxes and preservation supplies. "This place is incredible," he finally said. "I have walked past this hallway for 4 years and never knew it was down here." I gave a small nod. "Most students do." He smiled, not because I had made a joke, but because he seemed relieved that I had answered at all. "I am Kim." "I know." The words slipped out before I could soften them. He laughed quietly instead of looking offended. "Fair enough. Everyone knows me around here, whether they want to or not." That answer surprised me. It sounded less like confidence and more like someone who had grown tired of hearing his own name. Mrs. Lee returned carrying a large archival box and placed it carefully on the work table between us. Inside rested several handwritten journals belonging to Hawthorne University's founder, each wrapped in acid-free tissue paper. "The history department wants these restored before Founders Week," she explained. "You will be documenting every repair, photographing each stage, and preparing a public exhibition together." She handed us a project schedule before leaving again. Kim looked down at the first journal with visible respect. "I have never worked with anything this old." "Then do not rush," I answered. "Old paper punishes people who rush." He looked at me for a second before nodding seriously. "I will remember that." We spent the next hour reviewing preservation procedures. I expected him to become impatient with the slow pace, but he asked thoughtful questions instead. He listened carefully whenever I explained why one cleaning method was safer than another or why humidity mattered more than people realized. Not once did he pretend to know something he did not. Somewhere around the middle of the afternoon, while we were comparing handwriting samples inside 2 different journals, Kim suddenly frowned. "Can I ask you something?" I looked up. "Why does everyone seem nervous around me?" The question caught me completely off guard. I hesitated long enough that he smiled without taking offense. "See," he said gently, "even you are trying to find the polite answer." I considered lying, but there seemed little point. Maybe because they expect you to already have everything figured out. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. The smile remained, but something behind it faded for just a moment. "That sounds exhausting," I admitted. He looked down at the journal again before answering softly. "Sometimes it is." Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute after that. The silence was comfortable instead of awkward. We simply continued working, turning fragile pages one at a time while late afternoon sunlight filtered through the narrow basement windows. By the time we finished cataloging the first journal, it no longer felt like I was sitting beside the university's golden student. It felt like I was working with another student who genuinely cared about preserving something meaningful. As we packed away the materials, Kim noticed a sketchbook partially hidden beneath one corner of the table. "Did you draw these?" he asked after opening it just enough to see detailed pencil studies of old architecture and restored book bindings. I instinctively reached for it. "They are just practice." He carefully closed the cover without looking at another page. "Thank you for letting me see even that much," he said. "You are talented." Nobody outside the archive had ever said those words to me. I did not know how to respond. Kim gathered his notebook, wished me a good evening, and walked toward the hallway. Just before disappearing around the corner, he turned back. "Same time tomorrow?" I nodded once. "Tomorrow?" After he left, I stood alone in the restoration room wondering why the conversation had felt so unexpectedly easy. Upstairs, however, David Williams stood near the archive entrance and quietly watched Kim leave the basement hallway. David had served beside Kim in student council for nearly 2 years and had recently noticed Kim turning down networking events to spend more time in special collections. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to another student leadership officer. He is already choosing the archive project over everything we planned. It started sooner than I expected. The following week settled into a rhythm neither of us had expected. Every afternoon after my classes ended, I headed downstairs to the archives, and almost every day Kim arrived within a few minutes carrying the same notebook, a bottle of water, and enough questions to make the hours pass faster than I thought possible. The project itself demanded patience. We documented faded handwriting, compared ink pigments, photographed damaged bindings, and recorded every repair according to university preservation standards. It was meticulous work that most students would have found painfully slow, yet Kim never complained. If anything, he seemed grateful for a place where nobody interrupted him every 5 minutes asking for advice, signatures, or leadership decisions. Our conversations gradually expanded beyond restoration techniques. We talked about favorite books, childhood hobbies, road trips we hoped to take someday, and the strange pressure college students placed on themselves to appear completely certain about the future. To my surprise, Kim listened far more than he talked. When I mentioned a novel I admired because the main character quietly rebuilt his life after disappointment instead of becoming a hero overnight, Kim smiled and admitted it had been one of his favorite books since high school. That unexpected connection lingered with me long after the conversation moved on. One afternoon, Mrs. Lee asked us to move several archival storage boxes from a temporary storage room across the east courtyard to the main archive before a scheduled maintenance inspection. Each box was light enough for one person, so Kim and I carried one apiece. As we crossed the courtyard on our way back to the archive entrance, a sophomore walking past glanced toward us, slowed down, and casually lifted a phone. I barely noticed. Kim did not notice at all. We continued discussing a handwritten note we had discovered inside one of the founder's journals, debating whether it had been written by the founder himself or by an early librarian decade later. Less than an hour afterward, while I organized restoration photographs inside the archive office, Kim's phone vibrated repeatedly on the table beside him. He glanced at the screen, sighed almost imperceptibly, then turned it face down without reading another notification. "Everything all right?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. "Probably nothing important." Something in his tone suggested the opposite, but I respected his decision not to explain. We returned to work, although I noticed he grew quieter for the rest of the afternoon. The next morning, the answer found me instead. While waiting outside a lecture hall, I overheard 2 students whispering nearby. "Have you seen the picture?" one asked. "Apparently Kim Martinez has a new favorite person." The other laughed softly. "The archive guy? Nobody even knew his name last week." My stomach tightened before I had even seen what they were talking about. Later that afternoon, another student accidentally left a campus social media page open on a library computer. There it was, a candid photograph showing Kim and me carrying archival boxes across the courtyard while laughing at something I could no longer remember saying. The image itself was harmless, but hundreds of comments beneath it were not. Some insisted Kim was mentoring an overlooked freshman. Others claimed I had somehow convinced the university's most admired student to help me for personal gain. A few people invented stories that had no connection to reality whatsoever. I quickly closed the page, hoping the rumors would disappear as quickly as they had appeared. Instead, they spread across campus over the next several days. People who had never spoken to me suddenly recognized me in the dining hall. A few smiled politely. Others watched from a distance with open curiosity. Nothing openly hostile happened, yet the attention felt deeply uncomfortable. Kim seemed aware that something had changed. "Has anyone been bothering you?" he asked quietly while labeling restoration photographs. "Not really," I answered honestly. "People are just paying attention." He looked disappointed rather than surprised. I was afraid of that. Before I could ask what he meant, someone knocked on the archive office door. Mrs. Lee stepped inside carrying a clipboard. "Kim," she said, "David Williams, the student council vice president, is upstairs asking if you have a minute. He says it is urgent." Kim exchanged a brief glance with me before standing. I will be back in a few minutes. I knew David's name even though I had never met him. He had worked beside Kim in student council for years and was widely expected to inherit much of Kim's campus influence after graduation. I nodded and continued organizing project files, but nearly 30 minutes passed before he returned. When he finally walked back into the restoration room, his calm expression had not disappeared, yet something behind his eyes had unmistakably changed. After setting his notebook on the table, he explained that David had warned him the photographs were beginning to affect student council donors, recruitment events, and the carefully managed public image surrounding his final year. Then Kim looked directly at me and quietly asked, "Maverick, has anyone ever warned you about becoming part of someone else's reputation?" For a moment, I was not sure how to answer. I had spent most of my life avoiding attention, so becoming connected to someone whose name seemed permanently attached to every university announcement had never crossed my mind. I looked at Kim and quietly admitted, "No, I have never really had a reputation worth talking about." A faint smile appeared on his face, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. "Sometimes that is a good thing," he said. "People build stories about you that have nothing to do with who you actually are." Before I could ask what David had wanted, Kim gently changed the subject by returning to the founder journals waiting on the table. I recognized the change immediately and decided not to push him. Whatever conversation had taken place upstairs clearly weighed on him, and everyone deserved at least one place where they did not have to explain themselves. The archives quietly became that place. Over the next several days, the rumors outside continued drifting through campus, but inside the restoration room life followed its familiar rhythm. We photographed repaired pages, compared handwritten annotations, and carefully prepared several journals for the upcoming Founder Heritage exhibition. Then one rainy afternoon, Mrs. Lee received an urgent request from the history department asking us to verify the contents of several unopened archival boxes that had recently been transferred from long-term storage. The boxes had remained untouched for years because they contained personal correspondence donated by former faculty members. As Kim and I carefully reviewed the inventory, I noticed that one sealed administrative transfer box carried two conflicting inventory labels. The exterior label identified it as former faculty correspondence, but a smaller security tag beneath it showed that the box had originally been routed to the student wellness office. It had apparently reached the archive after a barcode and labeling error during an earlier records transfer. "That cannot stay here," I said immediately. Kim agreed. "We should let Mrs. Lee know before we even open it." Just then, Mrs. Lee stepped away to answer a telephone call from the preservation laboratory. We waited for several minutes, but as I carefully moved the incorrectly labeled box away from the historical materials, its damaged side seam opened and a single loose page slid partly onto the table. Neither of us had intended to read anything, yet one sentence near the top of the exposed page immediately caught my attention before I could look away. It was not a medical record or confidential evaluation. Instead, it appeared to be an internal administrative memorandum discussing accommodations for a student experiencing severe academic exhaustion several years earlier. One line mentioned the student had temporarily considered withdrawing despite exceptional academic standing. My eyes instinctively dropped to the signature authorizing temporary accommodations. The student name beneath it read Kim Martinez. I immediately stopped reading and gently slid the page back into the folder without another glance. Kim had frozen beside me. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Mrs. Lee returned, noticed the misplaced folder, apologized for the filing mistake, and carried it away herself without realizing what had happened. Once the room became quiet again, Kim slowly sat down across from me. "You were not supposed to see that," he said softly. There was no anger in his voice, only disappointment that something deeply personal had accidentally become visible. I answered honestly. "I only saw enough to realize it was private. I did not keep reading." He looked at me carefully, almost as though trying to decide whether he believed me. "Most people would have." "Maybe," I replied, "but everyone deserves something that belongs only to them." His shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. For the first time since we met, He stopped trying to appear completely composed. He looked tired. Not physically tired after a long day, but emotionally tired in a way that could not be fixed by sleep. "People think awards make everything easier," he said after a long silence. "Sometimes they just make it harder to admit when you are struggling." I did not offer advice because none seemed appropriate. Instead, I quietly returned to documenting the restoration photographs. After another minute, Kim joined me without another word. Nothing dramatic happened that afternoon, yet something important shifted between us. We no longer sat across the table as the university's most celebrated senior and an anonymous freshman. We sat there as two students who had silently trusted each other with something neither of us intended to share. From that day forward, our conversations became noticeably different. Kim laughed more often. I found myself speaking without rehearsing every sentence in my head first. The walls I had carefully built around my own life began lowering without me realizing it. Unfortunately, while trust quietly grew inside the archives, assumptions continued growing everywhere else. As Kim packed his notebook that evening, his phone buzzed again. This time he looked at the screen, his expression immediately becoming serious. He handed the phone toward me without saying a word. Across the display was a campus discussion post showing our photograph once again, except someone had now added a caption that read, "Looks like the golden student finally found someone worth risking everything for." I stared at the screen for several seconds before handing the phone back to Kim. The caption alone would have been easy enough to ignore, but it was the comments underneath that unsettled me. Some people joked that the university's most respected senior had suddenly disappeared from networking events because of an unknown freshman. Others confidently claimed I had planned everything from the beginning, weaving together details that had never happened into stories that sounded believable only because so many strangers wanted to believe them. Kim quietly locked his phone and slipped it into his pocket. "You should not have to deal with this," he said. I forced a small smile. "Neither should you." He looked as though he wanted to say something more, but Mrs. Lee returned carrying another stack of preservation reports, and the conversation naturally ended. I told myself the rumors would fade once students found a new topic to discuss. Instead, they grew louder with every passing day. By the following week, people I had never met smiled at me in hallways as though they already knew my life. A few classmates casually asked what Kim was really like. Others wanted to know whether we were working together after hours. I answered every question the same way. "We are partners on the archive project." Most nodded politely, yet I could tell many of them preferred the version they had already invented. Even my quiet routine began changing. Finding an empty table in the dining hall became more difficult because people occasionally recognized me from the photograph. The attention itself was not hostile, but it slowly chipped away at the peaceful anonymity I had always appreciated. Then something happened that made the situation feel far more serious. One afternoon I arrived at the archives a little early and found Mrs. Lee reading an email with a troubled expression. She looked up as I entered and immediately closed the message. "Everything all right?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Someone anonymously contacted the history department asking whether student assistants are allowed to receive special treatment during faculty-sponsored projects." My stomach tightened. "Did they mention me?" She chose her words carefully. No names, just enough details that everyone knew which project they meant. Before I could respond, Kim walked into the room carrying several reference books. One glance at Mrs. Lee's face told him something had happened. She summarized the email without exaggeration, then assured us that the department had already confirmed every assignment had followed normal university procedures. Kim thanked her, but after she stepped away, he remained unusually quiet. We worked for almost an hour before he finally broke the silence. "This is becoming more organized than random gossip." I looked up from the restoration log. "You think someone is doing this on purpose?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his backpack and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table. "This was slipped under my apartment door last night." I unfolded it carefully. Contained no signature, only a short typed sentence. "Some reputations are too valuable to lose over the wrong person." My heartbeat quickened. There was nothing threatening about the message itself, but it was unsettling because it clearly referred to both of us. Kim calmly folded the paper again. I did not tell anyone because I hoped it was just immature behavior. Do you still think that? I asked. He looked directly at me. I am not sure anymore. That conversation stayed with me long after I left the archives that evening. Walking across campus, I began noticing how many people glanced in my direction before whispering to someone beside them. Maybe they had been doing that for days. Maybe I had simply refused to notice. Either way, the campus no longer felt quite as ordinary as it had only a few weeks earlier. 2 mornings later, everything changed again. I opened my student email before class and found dozens of unread messages flooding the university discussion board notifications. Someone had posted what appeared to be screenshots of private conversations claiming I had intentionally befriended Kim to improve my scholarship opportunities and build connections for my future career. The messages looked convincing at first glance, and within minutes the comments beneath them multiplied faster than anyone could possibly answer. I had never written a single one of those conversations, but as I stared at the screen, I realized something far more frightening than the rumors themselves. Whoever created them knew exactly which lies people would be most willing to believe. For several minutes I could not move. I opened each screenshot one after another, hoping I would quickly recognize an obvious mistake that everyone else would notice too. Instead, whoever created them had been disturbingly careful. The messages appeared to show me telling someone that becoming close to Kim would help me gain scholarship recommendations, build professional connections, and make people remember my name after graduation. Every sentence sounded believable enough to invite suspicion, yet none of it had ever happened. My first instinct was not anger. It was disbelief. I had spent my entire college life trying to avoid attention, and now hundreds of students were reading words I had never written. Before I could decide what to do, my phone rang. It was Kim. "Where are you?" he asked immediately. "Outside Henderson Hall. Stay there. I am coming." Less than 10 minutes later, he crossed the courtyard at a brisk pace. The moment he reached me, he asked only one question. "Did you write any of those messages?" I met his eyes without hesitation. "No." He nodded once. That is all I needed to know. His confidence should have reassured me, but I could already see groups of students quietly looking in our direction. The story was spreading much faster than the truth ever could. We walked together toward the archives without saying much. Once inside, Mrs. Lee closed the office door behind us after seeing our expressions. Kim showed her the screenshots. She read several pages before placing the papers back on the desk. "These need to be reported," she said calmly. "Do not argue with people online. Let the university investigate." Kim agreed immediately, but I hesitated. What if nobody believes the investigation? Mrs. Lee looked directly at me. Facts take longer than rumors, but facts last longer. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the day. Later that afternoon, Kim asked whether I would be willing to meet someone he trusted in the computer science department. The professor specialized in digital forensics and often supervised students analyzing manipulated online content for research projects. I agreed. The following morning, we met Professor Paul King in his office. After carefully reviewing the screenshots, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "At first glance, these look convincing," he admitted. "But convincing and authentic are not the same thing." My heart lifted slightly. He pointed towards several small inconsistencies in the formatting that most people would never notice. Timestamps were spaced differently from the current version of the messaging application. Certain punctuation marks had inconsistent font rendering. Even the image compression patterns suggested repeated editing before the screenshots were exported. "I cannot identify the person responsible today," Professor King explained, "but I can confidently say these images deserve a formal forensic review before anyone treats them as evidence." Walking out of his office, I felt hopeful for the first time in days. Kim looked relieved as well. "We finally have something real," he said. Unfortunately, our relief did not last long. By that evening, the screenshots had already reached several student organizations, alumni discussion groups, and even parents who followed university news online. Correcting the record suddenly felt much larger than proving a few edited images were fake. The rumors had developed a life of their own. 2 days later, Kim received an email requesting a private meeting with the Dean of Students. He invited me to come as well. Inside the office, the Dean listened carefully while Professor King summarized his preliminary findings and recommended a full digital investigation. The Dean thanked everyone for remaining professional throughout the situation before saying something none of us expected. "There is one additional complication," he said. "Our Information Technology Office has identified that whoever distributed these fabricated images appears to have accessed archived student records while preparing them." Kim immediately looked up. "Archived student records?" The Dean slowly nodded. "Which means this is no longer only about false rumors. Someone may have improperly accessed confidential university information." As silence settled across the room, I suddenly remembered the misplaced wellness folder that had accidentally revealed part of Kim's past weeks earlier. And for the first time I began wondering whether those two events had never been unrelated at all. The Dean ended the meeting by explaining that the university would handle both matters through separate but coordinated investigations. The fabricated screenshots would undergo a formal digital forensic review, while the possible access to confidential student records would be examined under university privacy policies. No conclusions would be announced until verified evidence existed. It sounded reasonable, yet as Kim and I walked out of the administration building, neither of us believed the rumors would quietly wait for the investigation to finish. Rumors rarely followed official timelines. They spread according to emotion, instead of facts. Over the following week, I noticed something changing inside Kim. He still attended meetings, answered emails, and fulfilled every responsibility expected of the university's golden student. But he seemed unusually thoughtful whenever people congratulated him or praised his leadership. One afternoon, while organizing exhibition materials in the archives, he quietly asked, "Do you know what the hardest part of being admired is?" I looked up from the display labels. "What?" He smiled faintly. "People become disappointed the moment you stop matching the version of you they created in their minds." I understood exactly what he meant because I was experiencing the opposite. People had created a version of me that never existed, and many had accepted it without ever speaking to me. Our conversations no longer revolved around restoration work or campus life. Instead, we found ourselves discussing trust, reputation, and how quickly strangers filled empty spaces with assumptions. Those quiet afternoons inside the archives became the only part of campus that still felt completely honest. Then, midway through the week, Professor King called Kim with an update. We met him in his office later that afternoon. He projected several comparison images onto a monitor, carefully explaining how metadata recovered from the fabricated screenshots showed repeated editing before publication. More importantly, the distribution pattern revealed that the anonymous account responsible for uploading the images had first accessed them through a university network connected to a student leadership office rather than a public wireless connection. Professor King remained careful with his wording. "This does not identify a specific individual," he explained, "but it significantly narrows where the material originated. A full identification would still require the university's Information Technology Office to compare account access logs, device registrations, upload times, and security records from the Student Leadership Suite." Professor King had already preserved the relevant metadata and formally transferred his findings to the university investigators. Kim exchanged a brief glance with me. Both of us immediately thought of the same person, yet neither of us spoke David's name. Evidence required patience. Assumptions had already caused enough damage. As we left the computer science building, Kim stopped walking for a moment. "The annual Golden Student Recognition Ceremony is next Friday," he said quietly. "I am supposed to give the closing speech." I nodded. Everyone on campus knew about that tradition. It was one of the university's most prestigious events, attended by students, faculty members, alumni, scholarship donors, and community leaders. Kim stared across the courtyard before continuing. "I already submitted my speech weeks ago. Are you thinking about changing it?" I asked. He looked at me with surprising calm. "I think I have to." Before I could respond, My phone vibrated with a message from Mrs. Lee asking me to return to the archives. When I arrived, she handed me a sealed envelope from the Office of Student Affairs. Inside was a brief notice confirming that the Founder Heritage Exhibition would proceed as scheduled despite the ongoing investigation. Attached to the notice was a revised list of exhibition volunteers. My name had been quietly removed. No explanation appeared anywhere on the page. Mrs. Lee looked genuinely disappointed. "This was not my decision," she said. "They told me they wanted to avoid unnecessary attention during the exhibition." I forced a smile that did not feel convincing. I understand. In truth, I did understand. Even without believing the rumors, the university wanted to protect its biggest public event from controversy. Walking back across campus that evening, I realized distancing myself from the exhibition might also protect Kim from additional speculation. That night, I sent him a short message explaining that I intended to step away from the archive project until everything was resolved. Less than a minute later, my phone rang. I watched his name appear on the screen, but I could not bring myself to answer. The next morning, he came looking for me before my first class, yet I quietly left through another hallway after seeing him from a distance. It was the hardest decision I had made since arriving at Hawthorne, but I convinced myself it was the right one. I would later learn that while I was trying to protect Ethan's future, he had been sitting alone in the student council office, deleting the carefully prepared speech everyone expected him to deliver and beginning to write an entirely different one. The morning of the Golden Student Recognition Ceremony arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that usually filled the campus with excitement. Banners lined the walkways, faculty members welcomed alumni back to Hawthorne University, and volunteers hurried between the auditorium and reception hall making last-minute preparations. For the first time since joining the archive project, I deliberately stayed away from everything connected to the event. I spent the morning helping Mrs. Lee organize restoration supplies that no longer needed my attention simply because it felt easier than watching the ceremony from a distance. She noticed my silence but respected it. Just before noon, she quietly placed a folded program on the table beside me. "Whether you attend or not," she said gently, "some moments become part of your life even if you try to avoid them." After she left, I looked at the program and saw Kim's name listed beneath the closing address exactly where everyone expected it to be. Meanwhile, across campus, the auditorium filled with students, professors, scholarship donors, alumni, and community leaders. Kim took his assigned seat backstage holding two different speeches. One was the polished version approved weeks earlier, celebrating leadership, academic excellence, and future success. The other existed only as several handwritten pages folded inside his jacket pocket. As the ceremony progressed, award after award was announced. Applause echoed through the auditorium, cameras flashed, and everything unfolded according to tradition. Then Professor King quietly entered through a side door and approached the dean. They exchanged only a few words before the dean's expression noticeably changed. Several minutes later, Kim's phone vibrated once. He glanced down and read a brief message from Professor King. "The forensic review is complete. Nothing more." Kim slipped the phone back into his pocket without opening any additional details. His name was called moments later. The audience welcomed him with the longest applause of the afternoon as he walked toward the podium. Standing there beneath the stage lights, he unfolded the prepared speech, looked down at the first page, then calmly folded it again without reading a single sentence. A quiet murmur spread through the auditorium. Even from the archives several buildings away, I had no idea that anything unusual was happening. Kim rested both hands lightly on the podium and spoke with a calmness that immediately silenced the room. He thanked the professors who had guided him, the classmates who had challenged him, and the staff members whose work often went unnoticed. Then his voice shifted. "Today I was expected to speak about achievement," he said. "Instead, I want to speak about assumptions." The audience grew perfectly still. He described how easily admiration could become pressure, how quickly people accepted incomplete stories, and how dangerous it was to confuse popularity with truth. Without naming me or revealing any confidential information, he explained that someone close to him had recently been judged by thousands of strangers based on material that had never been verified. He reminded everyone that leadership meant protecting fairness even when doing so was uncomfortable. Then he paused before saying the sentence no one expected. The person many believed was chasing my reputation never once asked me for a favor, never once used my name for personal gain, and never once treated me like anything other than another student. Throughout the auditorium, conversations stopped completely. Faculty members exchanged surprised glances while students quietly lowered their phones. Kim continued without raising his voice. If I stayed silent simply because speaking honestly might affect my own image, then none of the awards you have given me would deserve to exist. At that exact moment, Professor King handed the dean a printed summary of the completed forensic investigation. The dean quickly reviewed the first page before looking toward the stage with unmistakable relief. Back inside the archives, Mrs. Lee's office telephone rang. She answered, listened quietly for nearly a minute, then slowly turned toward me with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Maverick," she whispered. "They found who fabricated everything." Before I could ask another question, my own phone vibrated. It was a message from Kim containing only 7 words. "Please reach the auditorium before I leave." I reached the auditorium just as the ceremony was ending. Small groups of students stood quietly throughout the lobby, but the atmosphere felt completely different from only a few days earlier. People were no longer whispering. They were reading printed notices that had just been distributed by the Office of Student Affairs. The university had confirmed that the screenshots circulating online had been digitally fabricated. A formal investigation matched the upload times to David Williams's university account, registered laptop, and security access records from the student leadership suite. Investigators determined that he had improperly used his leadership access to obtain limited administrative information and combined it with manipulated images to create a false narrative. Investigators found no evidence that David held any personal grudge against Maverick. Instead, the evidence suggested that he had become convinced Kim's growing friendship with Maverick threatened the carefully managed public image surrounding the university's most celebrated student. Believing he was protecting that image, David deliberately manufactured a false narrative to drive them apart. The university announced disciplinary action for serious student conduct violations, misuse of university access privileges, and violations of student privacy policies. No confidential personal records were released publicly, and the administration emphasized that protecting student privacy remained a priority throughout the investigation. The investigation also confirmed that David had never accessed Kim's student wellness records. The misplaced folder Maverick and Kim had encountered was traced to an unrelated barcode error during a records transfer several years earlier. David had accessed only scholarship status, project assignments, and student leadership scheduling information, which he then combined with fabricated messages to make his story appear credible. As I stood there trying to absorb everything, Kim walked out of the auditorium carrying nothing except the folded handwritten speech he had actually delivered. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled in the same quiet way he had smiled the first afternoon we met in the archives. "I was hoping you would come," he said. I looked down, unsure how to answer. "I thought leaving would make things easier for you." He gently shook his head. "You leaving only made me realize what mattered." We slowly walked back across campus together, following the same brick path that had become so familiar over the past several weeks. Students passed by, but nobody interrupted us. Some offered polite smiles. Others simply continued walking. For the first time since the rumors began, the attention no longer felt heavy. When we reached the archives, Mrs. Lee greeted us with the warm expression of someone who had quietly believed the truth would eventually find its way forward. She handed us the final restoration journal, explaining that one last inspection remained before the Founder Heritage Exhibition could officially open. Together we carefully examined the restored binding and gently opened the final pages. Tucked inside the back cover was a handwritten letter from the university founder that had remained hidden for decades because 2 sheets had become lightly sealed together over time. Preservation work had finally separated them safely. Most of the letter discussed funding, curriculum, and the university's earliest graduating class. Near the final paragraph, however, One sentence made Mrs. Lee stop reading for a moment. Mrs. Lee carefully unfolded the letter and read it aloud. A university fulfills its purpose not by creating flawless graduates, but by giving ordinary people the courage to become their most honest selves. None of us spoke immediately afterward. Somehow those words seemed written not only for student generations ago, but for everyone. Standing in that quiet room. The following week, the Founder Heritage Exhibition opened successfully as scheduled. The restored journals became one of its most visited displays, and beside them a small exhibit acknowledged the student restoration team. My name appeared beside Kim's, not because either of us had become more important than anyone else, but because we had completed the work together. Around the same time, Kim made another decision that surprised nearly everyone. Although he had received several prestigious job offers after graduation, he accepted a one-year university research fellowship focused on historical preservation and student mentorship instead. It was the first major decision he openly admitted making for himself rather than for other people's expectations. One evening after the exhibition closed, we stood outside the old library watching the last rays of sunlight settle across the campus lawn. Kim laughed softly, although the nervousness in his eyes made me realize the question mattered more than he wanted to admit. Would you finally let me invite you to dinner without pretending it is another project meeting? I smiled. Are you asking as my former project partner? No, he answered quietly. I am asking because somewhere between those journals, the rumors, and every afternoon you treated me like an ordinary person, I started caring about you as something more. I kept telling myself it was only respect for a project partner. Somewhere along the way, I realized I had been looking forward to seeing you long before I admitted why. I could not help smiling. Then I think dinner sounds like a very good place to begin. We walked away together with no audience, no applause, and no expectations left to satisfy. Somehow that ordinary walk across campus felt more meaningful than any ceremony either of us had attended. Looking back now, I sometimes think the most valuable things we carry through life are not the awards hanging on a wall or the titles printed beside our names. They are the quiet moments when someone chooses to believe our character instead of the loudest rumor, or when we finally allow ourselves to be known without hiding behind expectations. There are times when honesty feels risky because it may disappoint people who only know a carefully polished version of us. Yet this story gently reminds us that trust often grows in ordinary conversations, patient actions, and the willingness to see another person as they truly are rather than as the world describes them. Perhaps the strongest relationships are not built during life's biggest celebrations, but during the quiet seasons when understanding matters more than recognition. If you found yourself in Maverick's place or Kim's place, what choice do you think you would have made? I would truly enjoy hearing what part of their journey stayed with you the most and what this story made you reflect on in your own life.